The first shot rang out just as Margaret Owens slipped her white satin wedding dress over her head, the sound of gunfire merging with the thunder that rolled across the Montana sky. The year was 1876, and the small frontier town of Silverridge was supposed to witness her wedding that day, not her descent into widowhood before she'd even spoken her vows. Margaret stood frozen, the delicate fabric pooling at her feet as her mother burst through the door of their modest home. "They've shot him! Those Caldwell boys, they've shot Edward!" The world tilted beneath Margaret's feet. Edward Williams, her fiancé of 2 years, the man who had traveled 300 miles to make his fortune in the silver mines so they could start a proper life together, was dead. Shot down in the muddy main street like a dog, all because of a claim dispute with the notorious Caldwell brothers. The wedding guests became funeral attendees by sundown. Margaret sat stone-faced in the front pew of the small white church that should have hosted her nuptials, still wearing her wedding dress. The silver locket Edward had given her hung heavily around her neck, containing a small photograph of them both and a lock of his dark hair. "You should change, dear," her mother whispered, but Margaret didn't respond. Couldn't respond. That night, as rain lashed against the windows of her bedroom, Margaret crawled into bed still wearing the white satin gown, now stained with tears and mud from kneeling at Edward's fresh grave. Her mother tried to coax her out of it, but Margaret simply turned to the wall and closed her eyes. "I'll wear it until I join him," she whispered to no one. Days turned to weeks. Margaret moved through life like a ghost, attending to her duties at her father's general store with vacant eyes, returning home each night to sleep in her wedding dress. The townsfolk whispered, some with pity, others with the cruel fascination that often accompanied tragedy on the frontier. "She's gone mad with grief. Poor Maggie's lost her mind. Someone should do something about that girl." But no one did. Her parents, devastated by her deterioration but unsure how to help, eventually stopped trying to convince her to change. The pristine white of the dress gradually faded to a dull ivory, the delicate lace fraying at the edges as Margaret wore it day after day, night after night, until 3 months after Edward's death, when a stranger rode into Silverridge. The tall cowboy dismounted his chestnut stallion outside the general store just as Margaret was sweeping the porch. Despite the summer heat, she wore a dark shawl over her wedding dress, her auburn hair pulled back in a severe knot. She didn't look up as the stranger approached, the spurs on his boots jangling with each step. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice deep with a slight drawl. "I'm looking for a man named Thomas Henderson." Margaret continued sweeping, her movements mechanical. "He lives at the edge of town, last house on Willow Road." She expected him to leave, but instead, he remained standing there. Finally, she looked up. The cowboy stood over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders tapering to a narrow waist. Dust from the trail covered his dark denim pants and faded blue shirt. A weathered brown hat shaded eyes the color of whiskey, and several days' worth of stubble covered his strong jaw. He was studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Is there something else you need?" she asked. "No, madam." He tipped his hat. "Thank you for the direction." As he turned to leave, Margaret noticed the silver star pinned to his vest. "You're a lawman," she said. He turned back. "U.S. Marshal Jackson Irwin, madam." Something flickered in Margaret's eyes, the first spark of interest she'd shown in anything since Edward's death. "Are you here about the Caldwell brothers?" Marshal Irwin's expression remained neutral. "What do you know about the Caldwells, miss? Owens, Margaret Owens." She leaned the broom against the wall and stepped closer. "They murdered my fiancé 3 months ago, the day we were to be married." Understanding dawned in his eyes as he took in her appearance more carefully, noticing the wedding dress beneath her shawl. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Owens," he said, his voice softening slightly. "And yes, I'm here about the Caldwells. They've been causing trouble across 3 territories. Your fiancé wasn't their first victim." "Our sheriff did nothing," Margaret said bitterly. "Said there wasn't enough evidence. That's why I'm here, to make sure justice is served." He studied her for a moment. "If you have information that could help, I'd appreciate hearing it." Margaret glanced back at the store where her father was helping a customer. "I get off at 6. I can meet you at the Silverbrook Inn." Marshal Irwin nodded. "I'll be there, Miss Owens." That evening, Margaret sat across from Jackson Irwin in the small dining room of the Silverbrook Inn. She had considered changing clothes for the first time in months, but ultimately decided against it. The wedding dress had become her armor, a constant reminder of what she'd lost and what she was owed justice. "The Caldwells arrived in Silverridge about a year ago," Margaret explained, her voice low. "4 brothers, they claimed a silver mine that Edward had already registered. When he showed them the papers, they laughed. Said, 'Paperwork didn't mean much out here.'" Jackson nodded, making notes in a small leather-bound book. "That's their usual approach. They've done the same in Colorado and Wyoming." Edward went to the sheriff, but Sheriff Miller is afraid of them. Everyone is. Margaret twisted the silver locket between her fingers. "The night before our wedding, Edward confronted them at the saloon. There was an argument, but no violence. The next morning, our wedding day, Levi Caldwell, the oldest brother, shot Edward in the back as he was walking to the church. Witnesses? Half the town. But no one will testify against them, not after what happened to Mr. Peterson when he spoke up." Jackson leaned forward. "What happened to Peterson?" "His barn burned down, his horses too." Margaret met his gaze steadily. The message was clear. "I need names, Miss Owens. People who saw what happened, even if they're too scared to come forward officially right now." As they talked, Margaret felt something shifting inside her. For the first time since Edward's death, she felt a purpose beyond simply existing. By the time they finished their meal, she had given Jackson the names of a dozen potential witnesses and detailed information about the Caldwells' routines, hideouts, and associates. "You've been paying attention," Jackson remarked as they stood outside the inn. "I have nothing else to do," Margaret replied simply. He studied her in the glow of the gas lamp. "What will you do, Miss Owens, when this is over, when the Caldwells face justice?" Margaret looked down at her dress, now dingy and worn. "I don't know. I haven't thought beyond vengeance." "Vengeance won't bring him back," Jackson said gently. "Neither will forgiveness," she replied sharply. He nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. "I'll be staying in town for a few days, gathering evidence. If you think of anything else that might help, you know where to find me." For the first time in months, Margaret didn't immediately retreat to her bed upon returning home. Instead, she sat by her window, watching the street below as her mind worked through everything she knew about the Caldwells. When she finally did lie down, still wearing her wedding dress as she had every night since Edward's death, her sleep was restless, with dreams not of Edward, but of justice delivered by a tall marshal with whiskey-colored eyes. The next morning, Margaret was at the general store earlier than usual, organizing inventory with an efficiency that surprised her father. "You're looking better today, Maggie," he said cautiously. "I spoke with Marshal Irwin last night," she replied, not looking up from her task. "He's going after the Caldwells." Her father's expression darkened. "Be careful, Margaret. Many lawmen have gone after those boys. None have succeeded." "This one is different," she said, though she couldn't explain why she believed it. Just after noon, the bell above the door jingled, and Jackson Irwin stepped into the store. He nodded to Margaret's father before approaching her. "Miss Owens, I was wondering if you might show me where your fiancé's claim is located," he said. "I'd like to see the site for myself." Margaret glanced at her father, who reluctantly nodded his approval. "I'll have the wagon ready in 15 minutes, she said. The ride to Edward's claim took nearly an hour, the wagon bumping along the rough trail that led into the foothills west of town. Margaret handled the reins with practiced ease, while Jackson sat beside her scanning their surroundings with alert eyes. "Have you lived in Silverridge your whole life?" he asked as they traveled. "Born and raised," she confirmed. "My parents came out from Pennsylvania in '52 during the first silver rush. My father opened the store, and my mother taught school until I was born." "And Edward?" Margaret's grip on the reins tightened slightly. "He came from Missouri 2 years ago. He was working for the railroad at first, saving every penny. Then he struck silver in these hills." She paused. We were going to build a house on the claim after we married, start a family. Jackson was quiet for a moment. I lost someone too, my wife, Clara, 5 years ago. Margaret glanced at him. I'm sorry. Was she ill? No, outlaws. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes hardened. We had a small ranch in Texas. They came for our horses. Clara confronted them while I was checking the south pasture. By the time I heard the shots and got back, he trailed off. Did you find them? The men who did it? Jackson nodded once. I tracked them for 6 months. When I finally caught up to them, I was so consumed with rage, I nearly became the very thing I hated. He looked at her directly. That's when I decided to pin on this badge, to pursue justice, not vengeance. There's a difference. Is there? Margaret asked softly. Sometimes I think justice is just vengeance wearing a badge. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. You might be right about that, Miss Owens. They arrived at Edward's claim, a small clearing with the entrance to a mine shaft and the beginnings of a cabin Edward had started building for them. Margaret felt a sharp pain in her chest as she looked at the half-finished structure, the roof still missing, the walls exposed to the elements. Jackson examined the official claim marker in the mine entrance before walking over to the cabin. He was building this himself? Margaret nodded, climbing down from the wagon. Every Sunday after church, he said we couldn't afford to hire help, not if we wanted to have enough saved for a proper start. She ran her hand along one of the rough-hewn logs. He was so proud of it. Jackson watched her closely. You come here often? Not since... She swallowed hard. This is the first time since he died. As they stood there, a sudden crack of a twig in the surrounding forest made Jackson reach for his revolver. Margaret froze, her heart pounding. Get behind me, Jackson whispered, drawing his weapon. Margaret didn't move fast enough. A voice called out from the trees. Well, look what we have here. The crazy bride and some stranger poking around Williams's claim. 2 men emerged from the forest, rifles pointed at them. Margaret recognized them immediately, Levi and Samuel Caldwell. Levi, the older of the two, was a burly man with a thick beard and cold eyes. He had been the one to pull the trigger on Edward. U.S. Marshal, Jackson said calmly, keeping his gun steady. Lower your weapons. Levi laughed. Another lawman? You boys never learn, do you? His eyes shifted to Margaret. Still wearing that dress, I see. You know, if Williams hadn't been so stubborn about this claim, you'd be a wife now instead of a crazy spinster. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. You murdered him in cold blood. I protected what's mine, Levi countered, just like I'm about to do now. He raised his rifle. This claim belongs to the Caldwells. You two are trespassing. The law says different, Jackson replied. Edward Williams registered this claim legally. You have no right to it. Samuel Caldwell spat on the ground. Law don't mean much out here, Marshal. You'd best remember that. Jackson's voice remained steady. I'm placing you both under arrest for the murder of Edward Williams and for threatening a federal officer. Levi's finger moved to the trigger of his rifle. I don't think so. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Jackson shoved Margaret toward the half-built cabin just as Levi fired. The bullet whizzed past, splintering wood where they had been standing. Jackson returned fire, hitting Samuel in the shoulder and sending him sprawling. Levi ducked behind a tree, firing again. Margaret crawled behind a stack of lumber, heart hammering in her chest. She could see Jackson taking cover by the wagon, exchanging shots with Levi. You okay, Miss Owens? Jackson called without taking his eyes off the forest. Yes, she managed to respond. The gunfire continued for several minutes, neither side gaining advantage. Then Margaret noticed Samuel, despite his wounded shoulder, circling around to get a clear shot at Jackson. Without thinking, Margaret grabbed a piece of firewood and hurled it at Samuel just as he was taking aim. It hit him squarely in the head, throwing off his shot and alerting Jackson to the danger. The marshal whirled and fired twice. Samuel dropped to the ground and didn't move again. Sammy! Levi roared from his position. You'll pay for that! He broke cover, charging toward Margaret with rage contorting his features. Jackson stepped into his path, and the two men collided. They went down in a tangle of limbs, Levi's rifle spinning away. Margaret watched in horror as they grappled on the ground, trading blows. Levi was larger, but Jackson was quicker. The marshal managed to land a solid punch that momentarily stunned the outlaw. But as Jackson reached for his fallen revolver, Levi pulled a knife from his boot and lunged. Margaret didn't hesitate. She grabbed the fallen rifle and swung it with all her strength. The butt of the weapon connected with Levi's head with a sickening crack, and he collapsed across Jackson's legs. For a moment, everything was silent except for their heavy breathing. Jackson pushed Levi's unconscious form off him and slowly got to his feet. His lip was bleeding, and a bruise was already forming on his cheek. "Are you hurt?" he asked, moving to Margaret's side. She shook her head, still gripping the rifle. "No. You?" "I've had worse." He gently took the rifle from her hands. "That was brave, Miss Owens. Foolish, but brave." Margaret looked down at her wedding dress, now torn and smeared with dirt and pine needles from crawling on the ground. Somehow the damage didn't bother her. "What happens now?" she asked. Jackson checked to make sure Levi was securely unconscious before binding his hands. Samuel wasn't moving, and a quick check confirmed he was dead. "Now we take Levi back to town, lock him up, and send for the circuit judge." Jackson looked at her. "And you, Miss Owens, are going to be the star witness?" The ride back to Silverridge was tense, with Levi Caldwell tied and unconscious in the back of the wagon. Word spread quickly once they reached town. Sheriff Miller initially resisted taking Levi into custody, but faced with a U.S. Marshal and the growing crowd of townsfolk, emboldened by seeing one of the Caldwell brothers in chains, he reluctantly agreed. "The other two brothers are still out there," Jackson warned Margaret as they stood outside the jail. "You should stay with friends or family until they're caught." "I'm not afraid," she said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. Jackson's expression softened. "I know you're not, but I'd rest easier knowing you were safe." That night, for the first time since Edward's death, Margaret considered removing her wedding dress. It was filthy and torn now, hardly the pristine garment she'd planned to wear as she began her life with Edward. As she stood before her mirror, she touched the lace at the collar, remembering the day she'd first tried it on, how Edward had saved for months to buy the fabric. But she also remembered the surge of something other than grief she'd felt when she'd helped capture Levi Caldwell. It hadn't been happiness exactly, but purpose. Life. Still, she couldn't bring herself to take it off, not yet. Instead, she carefully washed the worst of the dirt from the fabric and mended a tear in the sleeve before crawling into bed, the familiar weight of the dress a comfort despite everything. The next morning she was awakened by frantic pounding on the front door. Her father's voice echoed up the stairs. "Margaret, come quickly!" She rushed downstairs to find Jackson Irwin in their parlor, his expression grim. "What's happened?" she demanded. "Jed and Walter Caldwell rode into town an hour ago with a dozen hired guns," Jackson explained. "They've surrounded the jail demanding Levi's release. Sheriff Miller is close to giving in." "He can't do that," Margaret exclaimed. "I agree, but we're outnumbered," Jackson replied. "I need to get Levi out of town before his brothers break him out or the sheriff caves." Margaret's father wrung his hands anxiously. "What can we do?" Jackson turned to Margaret. "I need a diversion, and I need someone who knows the back trails out of this valley. Someone who can help me get Levi to the territorial prison in Helena without getting ambushed." Margaret straightened her shoulders. "I know every trail within 50 miles of Silverridge." "Margaret, no," her father protested. "It's too dangerous." But she was already thinking ahead. "There's an old mining trail that runs north through Blackwater Canyon. It's rough going, but no one uses it anymore since the cave-in 3 years ago. The Caldwells wouldn't know about it." Jackson studied her for a moment. "Are you certain you want to do this? It could mean putting yourself in the line of fire." "I already did that yesterday," she replied simply. Her father recognized the determination in her eyes, the same determination that had kept her in her wedding dress for months, turning grief into a fortress around her heart. "Let me come with you," he pleaded. Margaret shook her head. "You need to stay here, Father. Mother needs you." She turned back to Jackson. "When do we leave?" As soon as possible. Can you be ready in an hour? Margaret glanced down at her wedding dress, now clean but still bearing the marks of yesterday's confrontation. Yes. I'll need to change first. Jackson and her father both looked surprised. I can't very well ride through Blackwater Canyon in a wedding dress, she said practically. An hour later, Margaret met Jackson behind the general store, wearing a split riding skirt and blouse she hadn't touched since before Edward's death. Her hair was braided practically down her back, and she'd packed supplies in saddlebags that now hung from her mare's flanks. Jackson looked at her differently, she noticed, taking in the change in her appearance with an expression she couldn't quite read. The diversion is set, he told her. Your father and some of the other shopkeepers are going to stage a confrontation with the Caldwells on Main Street. As soon as it starts, I'll bring Levi out the back of the jail, and we'll meet you here. Be careful, Margaret said. Jed Caldwell is smarter than Levi. He won't be easily fooled. I'm counting on it, Jackson replied with a grim smile. The diversion worked better than expected. A carefully staged argument between Margaret's father and the owner of the hardware store escalated into a brawl that soon involved half the town. In the confusion, Jackson slipped Levi out the back of the jail and onto a horse, the outlaw's hands bound to the saddle horn. They met Margaret as planned, and the three set off immediately, taking a circuitous route through back alleys until they reached the eastern edge of town. From there, Margaret led them into the hills, following a barely visible trail that wound through dense pine forest. How long will it take to reach Helena this way? Jackson asked as they rode. 3 days if we push hard, Margaret replied. The trail gets treacherous through the canyon, and we'll need to cross Wolf River, but it's the safest route from the Caldwells. Levi, who had been sullen and silent until now, laughed harshly. You think you're so clever, don't you? My brothers will find me, and when they do, you'll both wish you'd never been born. Keep talking, Caldwell, Jackson said mildly. Every word you say is another year I'll recommend to the judge. They rode hard until dusk, making good progress through the increasingly rugged terrain. When they finally stopped to make camp in a small clearing, Margaret busied herself preparing a simple meal while Jackson secured Levi to a tree. You're not what I expected, Miss Owens, Jackson commented as they ate, keeping a watchful eye on their prisoner. What did you expect? She asked, stirring the beans she'd heated over the small fire. When I first saw you in that wedding dress, sweeping the porch like a ghost, I thought you were... He hesitated. Crazy? She supplied. The whole town thinks so. No, not crazy, just lost. He met her gaze across the fire. But you're not lost out here, are you? Margaret looked around at the wilderness surrounding them. Edward and I used to ride these trails together. He taught me how to track, how to find water, how to navigate by the stars. A small smile touched her lips. He said a frontier wife needed to know these things. He sounds like a good man. He was. The familiar pain rose in her chest, but it felt different now, less raw, more like an old wound that was finally beginning to heal. What was she like? Your wife? Jackson was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, Clara was fearless. She grew up on a cattle ranch, could outride and outshoot most men I knew. His eyes grew distant with memory. She had this laugh that could make a room full of strangers feel like old friends. You loved her very much, Margaret said softly. I did. Still do, in a way. Jackson poked at the fire with a stick. But I've learned that loving someone who's gone doesn't mean you stop living. Took me a long time to figure that out. Margaret thought about the wedding dress she'd left behind the first time she'd willingly removed it in 3 months. I'm starting to understand that, she admitted. From his place against the tree, Levi made a disgusted sound. Christ, are you two going to moon over your dead lovers all night? Some of us are trying to sleep. Jackson threw a pine cone that hit Levi squarely in the chest. Show some respect. They took turns keeping watch that night, with Margaret insisting on taking a shift despite Jackson's initial reluctance. As she sat by the dying fire, rifle across her lap, she found herself thinking not about Edward and what might have been, but about the journey ahead and the man sleeping just a few feet away. Jackson Irwin was unlike any man she'd met before. There was a quiet strength in him, a steadiness that reminded her of the mountains themselves, and when he looked at her, he seemed to see beyond the grief that had defined her for so long. The thought both frightened and exhilarated her. Dawn broke with a light drizzle that soon turned into a steady rain. They packed up quickly and continued their journey, the going slower now as the trail became slick with mud. By midday, they had reached the entrance to Blackwater Canyon, a narrow passage between towering rock walls that seemed to scrape the low-hanging clouds. "It doesn't look passable," Jackson observed as they paused at the entrance. "It gets wider about a half-mile in," Margaret assured him. "The trail follows an old riverbed. We'll need to go single file at first." Levi, who had been unusually quiet all morning, suddenly became agitated. "You can't take me in there. The whole canyon could come down in this rain." Margaret exchanged a glance with Jackson. "He's not entirely wrong," she admitted. "There have been rock slides before, but it's still safer than risking an ambush on the main trail." Jackson studied the looming walls of the canyon. "We'll proceed with caution. I'll lead, then Levi, with you bringing up the rear, Miss Owens. Keep your eyes on the walls as we go." The passage through the canyon was tense. The rain continued to fall, forming small rivulets that ran down the rock faces on either side. Several times they had to dismount and lead the horses around fallen boulders or across sections where the trail had partially washed away. They were about halfway through when a low rumble echoed through the canyon. "What was that?" Jackson called back, reining his horse to a halt. Margaret listened intently, her heart beginning to race as the rumble came again, louder this time. "Rock slide!" she shouted. "We need to move!" They urged their horses forward as small rocks began to pelt down around them. The trail widened slightly, offering marginally more protection against the canyon walls, but the rumbling grew louder. Suddenly, a section of the wall above them gave way. Margaret watched in horror as a cascade of rocks and earth tumbled down directly toward Jackson and Levi. "Look out!" she screamed. Jackson's horse reared in panic, nearly unseating him. Levi, hands bound to his saddle, couldn't control his mount as it bolted forward, directly into the path of the falling debris. Without hesitation, Jackson spurred his horse after Levi's, reaching the outlaw just as the main force of the rockslide hit. Margaret lost sight of them both in the cloud of dust and debris. When the dust settled, Margaret found herself alone on the trail, a massive pile of rock and earth blocking the way forward. Her heart pounding, she dismounted and scrambled toward the debris. "Marshal Irwin! Jackson!" she called, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. Silence greeted her, then a faint groan from somewhere within the rubble. Margaret began frantically moving smaller rocks, calling out again. "Here," came Jackson's strained reply. "We're trapped on the other side." Relief flooded through her. "Are you hurt?" "Scraped up, but nothing serious. Levi's unconscious, took a blow to the head, but he's breathing." Margaret assessed the rock slide. It extended from wall to wall, at least 15 feet high. There was no way she could clear it alone. "I can't get through," she called. "I'll have to go around and meet you on the other side." "No," Jackson replied immediately. "It's too dangerous to split up. The Caldwells could be anywhere. Head back to Silverridge and get help." "That will take too long," Margaret argued. "There's another way. If I backtrack and take Cottonwood Pass, I can reach the northern end of the canyon by nightfall." Silence from the other side. Then, "That's at least 20 miles of rough country, and you'd be alone." "I know these mountains, Jackson," Margaret said firmly. "I'll be fine. Just stay put and take care of Levi." "Margaret," his voice softened. "Be careful." It was the first time he'd called her by her first name. "I will," she promised. The journey back through the canyon was tense, every small sound making Margaret fear another rockslide. Once clear, she pushed her mare hard, taking a steep trail that switchbacked up the mountainside toward Cottonwood Pass. The rain finally stopped by late afternoon, but dark clouds still hung low over the mountains, threatening more to come. Margaret kept moving, knowing she needed to reach the pass before dark. She tried not to think about Jackson, trapped on the other side of the rock slide with an unconscious prisoner, or about the Caldwell brothers, who could be tracking them even now. Instead, she focused on the trail ahead, on the rhythm of her horse's hooves, on the plan forming in her mind. If she could reach the northern exit of the canyon by nightfall, she could find Jackson by morning. Then, they would still have a chance to reach Helena before the Caldwells caught up. The trail grew steeper as she approached the pass, forcing her to dismount and lead her tired mare. The higher elevation brought a biting chill to the air, and Margaret pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. As she crested the pass, the sun broke briefly through the clouds, bathing the valley below in golden light. Margaret paused to catch her breath, taking in the view. From here, she could see for miles the winding ribbon of the Wolf River, the dark smudge of Blackwater Canyon cutting through the forest, and in the far distance, the faint outline of Silverridge. For a moment, she imagined Edward beside her, sharing the view as they had so many times before. But the image faded quickly, replaced by thoughts of Jackson, his quiet strength, his understanding eyes, the way he'd looked at her when she'd traded her wedding dress for practical riding clothes. With renewed determination, Margaret began the descent toward the northern end of the canyon. Night was falling when she finally reached the rocky plateau that overlooked the canyon's exit. From her vantage point, she could see a small campfire flickering below. Jackson had made it through and was waiting for her. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. As she studied the area, she noticed not one but 3 campfires scattered among the trees surrounding the canyon mouth, and moving between them were the unmistakable shapes of men with rifles. The Caldwells had found them. Margaret retreated into the trees, mind racing. There had to be at least 8 men down there, all armed, all waiting for Jackson to emerge with Levi. There was no way to reach him without being seen. Unless Margaret studied the steep canyon walls. There was a game trail that ran along the western ridge, treacherous in daylight, nearly suicidal in darkness, but it would bypass the Caldwells' position entirely. Decision made, she left her horse secured in a small clearing with access to grass and water, taking only her rifle, some ammunition, and basic supplies. The climb was grueling, made worse by the darkness and the loose rock underfoot. Several times she nearly lost her footing, saved only by grasping at scrub brush or outcroppings of rock. By the time she reached a position above Jackson's camp, her hands were bleeding from countless small cuts, and every muscle ached. But she could now see clearly into the small clearing where Jackson had built his fire. He sat with his back to a boulder, rifle across his knees, scanning the darkness that surrounded him. Levi was propped against a tree nearby, conscious now, but still bound. Margaret needed to alert Jackson without giving away her position to the Caldwells. Taking a small mirror from her pocket, she caught the firelight and directed a brief flash toward Jackson, then another. She saw him stiffen, his hand tightening on his rifle as his eyes searched the darkness. She flashed the mirror once more, then carefully began picking her way down toward him. "That's far enough." Jackson's voice came softly from the shadows as she approached the edge of the clearing. "It's me," Margaret whispered. Relief flooded his features as he lowered his rifle. "Margaret, how did you—" She quickly placed a finger to her lips, then gestured toward the north. "Caldwells," she mouthed silently. 8 men, surrounding the canyon exit. Jackson's expression hardened. He motioned for her to follow him to where Levi sat watching them with narrowed eyes. "Looks like your brothers found us," Jackson told the outlaw quietly. Levi smirked despite his bound hands. "Told you they would. You're both dead come morning." Margaret knelt beside Jackson. "There's another way out. A ravine on the east side that leads to Wolf River. It's steep but passable." "With a prisoner?" Jackson asked skeptically. "We don't have much choice," Margaret replied. "We're outnumbered and surrounded." Jackson studied her face in the firelight, noting the scratches and dirt that spoke of her difficult journey. Without warning, he reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "You're something else, Margaret Owens," he said softly. The touch sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold night air. For a moment, she forgot about the Caldwells, about their precarious situation, about everything except the warmth in Jackson's eyes. Levi made a disgusted sound. "If you two lovebirds are done, I'd like to point out that I ain't climbing down no ravine with my hands tied." The moment broken, Jackson turned his attention back to their prisoner. "You don't have a choice, Caldwell. It's either that or I leave you here for the wolves." They waited until the deepest part of the night before making their move. The fire had been allowed to die down to embers, and they moved with painstaking slowness to avoid making noise. Levi, despite his earlier protests, seemed to understand that his best chance of survival lay in cooperation. The ravine was exactly as treacherous as Margaret had described, a narrow, steep-sided cut in the earth that dropped nearly 100 feet to the river below. They descended using ropes from Jackson's pack, with Levi secured between them. By dawn, they had reached the Wolf River, exhausted but alive. The rushing water would cover their tracks and the sound of their passage as they followed it downstream, away from the Caldwell's position. "We need to rest," Jackson said as they found a sheltered spot beneath an outcropping of rock. "Just for a few hours." Margaret nodded, too tired to argue. They secured Levi to a sturdy pine, and Jackson took the first watch while Margaret curled up on a bed of pine needles. She was awakened by Jackson's hand on her shoulder, his voice urgent in her ear. "Riders coming, at least 3, maybe more." Margaret was instantly alert, grabbing her rifle as she scrambled to her feet. In the gray light of early morning, she could make out dust rising from the trail that paralleled the river about a half-mile downstream. "They must have figured out we didn't come out of the canyon," she whispered. Jackson nodded grimly. "And they know we'd head for the river. We need to move now." They quickly gathered their meager supplies and roused Levi, who had been watching them with increasing nervousness. "My brothers will kill you both," he said as Jackson checked his bonds. "But if you let me go now, I might be able to convince them to let you live." Jackson's laugh held no humor. "Nice try, Caldwell. You're facing the gallows for murder. There's nothing waiting for you either way." As they moved out, staying close to the riverbank where the ground was rocky and would leave fewer tracks, Margaret found herself walking beside Jackson while Levi trudged ahead of them. "How much farther to Helena?" Jackson asked quietly. 2 days at this pace," Margaret replied. "But there's a small settlement called Copper Creek about 10 miles ahead. They have a telegraph office. We could send for reinforcements." Jackson nodded. "Good thinking." He glanced at her. "You're holding up well." Margaret managed a tired smile. "I'm tougher than I look." "I noticed that the first day," he replied, his eyes warm. "Not many women would chase down their fiancé's killers wearing a wedding dress." The mention of the dress reminded Margaret of how far she'd come in just a few days. The grief was still there, a dull ache in her chest, but it no longer consumed her every waking thought. "I wore that dress for 3 months," she said quietly. "I think I was trying to hold on to something that was already gone." Jackson was silent for a moment. "We all find different ways to grieve. After Clara died, I couldn't sleep in our bed. Spent 6 months sleeping on the floor beside it." Margaret looked at him curiously. "What changed?" "Time," he said simply. "And realizing that Clara would have been the first to tell me to get up off that floor and live my life," he met her gaze. "Just like I suspect your Edward would have told you to take off that dress and remember him with joy instead of sorrow." The truth of his words struck deep. Edward had been full of life, always laughing, always looking toward the future. He wouldn't have wanted her trapped in perpetual mourning. Before she could respond, a shot rang out from the ridge above them, the bullet kicking up dirt at their feet. Jackson grabbed Margaret's arm, pulling her behind a large boulder as more shots followed. "It's Jed!" Levi shouted, dropping to the ground. "Jed, I'm down here!" "Shut up!" Jackson hissed, aiming his rifle at the ridge. Margaret peered around the boulder, trying to spot their attackers. She caught a glimpse of movement among the rocks above 3 men, maybe 4, working their way down toward the river. "We're pinned down," she said, checking her rifle. Jackson's expression was grim. "They've got the high ground in numbers. We need a diversion." Margaret scanned their surroundings, noting the bend in the river just ahead. "The current's strong past that bend. If we could reach it, we could use the river itself to escape." "Too risky with a prisoner," Jackson replied, firing a shot toward the ridge that sent one of their pursuers scrambling for cover. "What choice do we have?" Margaret countered. "They'll surround us if we stay here." A bullet ricocheted off the boulder inches from Jackson's head, showering them with stone fragments. He ducked lower, eyes meeting Margaret's. "All right," he decided, "but we go together. I'm not leaving you behind." The intensity in his voice made her heart beat faster. "I wasn't planning on staying," she replied with a small smile. Jackson turned his attention to Levi, who was trying to make himself as small as possible behind a fallen log. "Caldwell, you're coming with us, and if you make one wrong move, I'll shoot you myself. Understand?" Levi's face was pale with fear, but he nodded. "On my mark," Jackson said to Margaret. "We'll make a run for the bend. Stay low and keep moving no matter what." Margaret tightened her grip on her rifle, preparing herself. Jackson counted down silently with his fingers. 3, 2, 1. They broke cover simultaneously, running in a crouch toward the river bend, with Jackson dragging Levi between them. Bullets kicked up dirt around their feet as the Caldwell gang opened fire from the ridge. They were halfway to the bend when Margaret heard Jackson grunt in pain. He stumbled but kept moving, blood spreading across his left sleeve. "You're hit!" she gasped. "Keep going," he ordered through gritted teeth. They reached the shelter of the riverbank just as another volley of bullets peppered the ground behind them. The river rushed past, swift and cold, but it offered their only chance. "Can you swim with that arm?" Margaret asked Jackson, eyeing his bloody sleeve with concern. "I'll manage," he replied grimly. "You first. I'll follow with Caldwell." Margaret hesitated. "Together," she insisted. "You said we go together." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "So I did." They entered the river with Levi between them, the cold water stealing Margaret's breath as it closed over her waist. The current immediately began pulling them downstream, away from their pursuers but also toward the rougher water beyond the bend. "Hold on!" Jackson shouted as the current strengthened, sweeping them into the center of the river. Margaret fought to keep her head above water as they were carried downstream, the sounds of gunfire fading behind them. She could see Jackson struggling to keep both himself and Levi afloat with his injured arm. The outlaw, hands still bound, was thrashing in panic. The river narrowed suddenly, the current accelerating as it squeezed between rock walls. Margaret was slammed against a boulder, the impact driving the air from her lungs. She clung to the slippery surface, gasping. "Jackson!" she called, searching frantically for him in the churning water. She spotted him several yards downstream, still gripping Levi's collar as they bounced from rock to rock. With a final surge of energy, Margaret pushed off from the boulder and swam toward them, letting the current assist her. She reached them just as Jackson's grip on Levi was failing. Together, they managed to guide all three of them toward a calmer section where a gravel bar extended into the river. They dragged themselves onto it, collapsing in exhaustion. For several minutes they lay there, coughing up river water and catching their breath. Margaret was the first to recover, pushing herself up to check on Jackson's wound. "Let me see," she insisted, gently examining his arm. The bullet had torn through the muscle but missed bone and major blood vessels. "You're lucky, it's a clean wound." "Doesn't feel lucky," Jackson grimaced as she tore a strip from her already soaked shirt to bind the injury. Levi lay nearby, looking considerably worse for wear. The fight seemed to have gone out of him, replaced by a sullen resignation. "Your brothers aren't giving up, are they?" Margaret asked him as she finished bandaging Jackson's arm. Levi shook his head. "Jed won't stop until either I'm free or you're both dead. That's just how he is." Jackson struggled to his feet. "Then we'd better keep moving. Copper Creek can't be more than 5 miles from here." They continued downstream, staying close to the river where the going was easier. All three were soaked, cold, and exhausted, but the knowledge that Jed Caldwell and his men were still pursuing them kept them moving. By midday, they caught sight of smoke rising from chimneys in the distant Copper Creek. The small settlement consisted of little more than a trading post, a livery, and a dozen cabins scattered along the river, but to Margaret, it looked like salvation. "We need to be careful," Jackson warned as they approached. "We don't know who these people support. The Caldwells might have friends here." They entered the settlement cautiously, drawing curious stares from the few residents visible. Jackson led them directly to what appeared to be the trading post, still holding his revolver despite his injured arm. The proprietor, a grizzled older man with a shock of white hair, looked up as they entered. His eyes widened at the sight of them, soaked, battered, and clearly in trouble. "U.S. Marshal," Jackson identified himself, showing his badge. "I need to use your telegraph and secure this prisoner." The man's eyes shifted to Levi, recognition dawning. "That's one of them Caldwell boys," he stated flatly. "It is," Jackson confirmed. "He's wanted for murder and being transported to Helena to stand trial." The shopkeeper's expression hardened. "Caldwells killed my nephew last year. Claim dispute up near Silver Peak." He spat on the floor. "Telegraph is in the back room. You're welcome to it, Marshal." Relief washed over Margaret. They had found an ally. While Jackson sent telegrams requesting reinforcements, the shopkeeper, who introduced himself as Emmett Davis, provided them with dry clothes, food, and a secure place to hold Levi. News of their arrival spread quickly through the small settlement, and soon a small group of armed men had volunteered to help guard the prisoner. "Caldwells have made a lot of enemies around here," Emmett explained as he helped Margaret bandage Jackson's arm properly. "Folks will be glad to see one of them finally face justice." By evening, Margaret and Jackson were seated before the fire in Emmett's small living quarters behind the store. Levi was secured in a storage room under guard, and lookouts had been posted at the approaches to the settlement. "Reinforcements should reach us by tomorrow afternoon," Jackson said, wincing slightly as he shifted his injured arm. "Then we can complete the journey to Helena with a proper escort." Margaret nodded, staring into the fire. The events of the past few days seemed almost unreal now, the desperate flight through the canyon, the rock slide, the river. Yet here they were, alive against all odds. "What will you do after this?" she asked quietly. "After Levi is delivered to face justice?" Jackson was silent for a moment. "There are still 2 Caldwells out there. My job won't be done until they're brought in, too." "And after that?" Margaret pressed. He looked at her, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "I haven't thought that far ahead. What about you? Will you go back to Silverridge?" Margaret considered the question. The thought of returning to her parents' home, to the pitying glances of the townspeople, held little appeal. Yet what alternative did she have? "I don't know," she admitted. "Everything feels different now. I'm different." "That's not a bad thing," Jackson said softly. Their eyes met across the small space between them, and Margaret felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear or exhaustion. Without conscious thought, she found herself moving closer to him on the bench they shared. Jackson's good hand came up to touch her cheek, his fingers gentle against her skin. "Margaret," he began, his voice low. The door burst open, startling them apart. One of the lookouts stood there, rifle in hand, face urgent. "Riders coming," he announced. "At least a dozen, armed to the teeth. It's the Caldwells, and they've brought reinforcements." Jackson was on his feet instantly, the moment between them broken. "How long do we have?" 10 minutes, maybe less," the lookout replied. Margaret's mind raced. A dozen armed men against the handful of settlers who had volunteered to help them. The odds weren't good. "We need to evacuate," Jackson decided. "Get everyone who can't fight to safety." "And Levi?" Margaret asked. Jackson's expression was grim. "He stays with us. If we can hold out until reinforcements arrive." But they both knew the territorial marshals might not reach them in time. As the settlement erupted into activity, Margaret found herself helping Emmett gather ammunition and distribute it to the volunteers. The women and children were being sent to hide in a root cellar behind one of the more distant cabins, but Margaret refused to join them. "I can shoot as well as any man here," she told Jackson firmly when he suggested it, "and I've faced the Caldwells before." He didn't argue, merely nodded and handed her a shotgun to supplement her rifle. "Stay close to me," he said. We'll make our stand in the trading post. It's the sturdiest building." They barely had time to prepare their defenses before the first shots rang out. The Caldwell gang had surrounded the small settlement and were firing from the cover of the surrounding trees. "Hold your fire!" Jackson ordered the volunteers who had taken positions at windows and doorways. "Wait until they break cover." Margaret crouched beside him at a window overlooking the main approach to the trading post. Through the gathering dusk, she could make out shadowy figures moving between trees. One of them stepped into a clearing, and she recognized Jed Caldwell, a tall man with a bushy beard similar to Levi's. "That's Jed," she whispered to Jackson. He nodded, his expression hardening. "The last time I faced him, he had just robbed the bank in Butte, shot 2 people. He got away then, but not this time." A voice called out from the trees. "Marshal Irwin, we know you're in there with my brother. Send him out and we'll let the rest of you live." "That's not going to happen, Caldwell," Jackson shouted back. "Your brother's going to stand trial for murder, and so will you when we catch you." Jed's laugh carried across the distance. "You're outnumbered, Marshal. And from what I hear, you're wounded too. Be reasonable." "Being reasonable would mean surrendering a prisoner to a gang of outlaws," Jackson replied. "That's not going to happen." Margaret watched as Jed conferred with several men around him. They were planning something, and whatever it was, it wouldn't be good for those inside the trading post. "They're going to rush us," she predicted quietly. "Try to overwhelm us with numbers." Jackson reached over and squeezed her hand briefly. "We'll hold them off as long as we can. The reinforcements will come." The attack, when it came, was sudden and violent. The Caldwell gang charged from multiple directions at once, firing as they ran. The defenders responded in kind, and the air was filled with the thunder of gunfire and shouts. Margaret fired methodically, forcing herself to stay calm as bullets splintered the window frame beside her. She saw one of the attackers fall, then another, but they kept coming. Jackson moved from position to position, directing the defense with a steady voice despite his injury. His presence seemed to inspire the volunteers, who fought with a determination born of years of resentment toward the Caldwells and their kind. The first wave of attackers was repelled, but at a cost. 2 of the defenders were wounded, and ammunition was running low. Margaret helped tend to the injured men while Jackson checked on Levi, who remained secured in the storage room, terrified but unharmed. "They'll try again," Jackson said as he returned to Margaret's side. "Probably wait until full dark." "How much ammunition do we have left?" she asked. "Not enough for another assault like that one." His face was grim in the lamplight. Margaret's mind worked furiously. There had to be a way out of this, a solution they hadn't considered. Then it came to her. "Levi," she said suddenly. "We can use Levi." Jackson looked at her quizzically. "How?" "Not as a hostage or a shield," Margaret clarified quickly, seeing his expression. "As bait. If Jed thinks Levi is being moved, he'll focus on trying to free him. We could create a diversion, make them think we're trying to smuggle Levi out the back while the real Levi stays secure here." Understanding dawned in Jackson's eyes. Split their forces. It could work, but it's risky. Whoever plays the decoy would be in serious danger. "I'll do it," Margaret volunteered without hesitation. "Absolutely not," Jackson replied immediately. "It's too dangerous." "Who else then?" she challenged. "You're wounded, and we need every able-bodied man to defend this building. I'm the logical choice." They argued in heated whispers, but in the end, logic prevailed. As night fell completely, their plan was set in motion. Margaret was dressed in Levi's coat and hat, her hair tucked up and her form disguised as much as possible. A group of defenders would create a diversion at the front of the trading post, while Margaret, accompanied by Emmett, would slip out the back as if trying to escape with the prisoner. "If this works, they'll split their forces," Jackson explained to the defenders. "When they do, we hit them from behind." Margaret stood before Jackson in her disguise, trying to ignore the fear gnawing at her stomach. This was far more dangerous than anything she'd done before, but it was their best chance. "Be careful," Jackson said softly, his hand lingering on her arm. "Don't take unnecessary risks. If they see through the disguise, get back here immediately." Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. On impulse, she reached up and kissed him briefly on the cheek. "For luck," she whispered. The diversion began with a fusillade of gunfire from the front of the trading post, accompanied by shouts and movement designed to draw attention. In the confusion, Margaret and Emmett slipped out the back door and into the darkness. They moved quickly but quietly, heading for the river where a small boat was waiting. Behind them, the gunfire intensified as the defenders put on a convincing show of trying to break out. They had almost reached the boat when a voice called out from the darkness. "That ain't Levi!" Margaret froze, her hand going to the pistol at her waist. Emmett raised his shotgun as three figures emerged from the shadows, blocking their path to the river. "It's the woman," one of them said, "the one who was with the marshal." Margaret recognized the speaker as Walter Caldwell, the youngest of the brothers. He was barely more than a boy, perhaps 19 or 20, but his eyes held the same cold brutality as his older siblings. "Where's my brother?" Walter demanded, his rifle trained on them. "Safe," Margaret replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Which is more than I can say for you if you don't lower that weapon." Walter laughed. "You're in no position to make threats, lady. Drop your guns, both of you, or I'll shoot you where you stand." Margaret's mind raced. The diversion had worked. At least some of the Caldwell gang had been drawn away from the main assault, but now she and Emmett were in grave danger. She needed to buy time for Jackson's plan to work. "Your brother Levi is going to hang," she said boldly. "Nothing you can do will change that, but you don't have to share his fate." Walter's face contorted with rage. "Shut up. You don't know anything about us." "I know you killed my fiancé," Margaret replied, her voice suddenly fierce. "Shot him in the back on our wedding day. I know you're nothing but cowards who prey on people weaker than yourselves." One of Walter's companions, an older man with a scarred face, shifted uncomfortably. "Walter, we should get back. This could be a trap." "Not until she tells us where Levi is," Walter insisted. The standoff continued for several tense moments. Then, from the direction of the trading post, came the sound of renewed gunfire, much more intense than before. The reinforcements had arrived. The scarred man grabbed Walter's arm. "We need to go now." Walter hesitated, torn between his desire to find his brother and the obvious danger. In that moment of indecision, Margaret drew her pistol and fired, hitting one of the men in the leg. Emmett's shotgun roared, sending the scarred man diving for cover. Walter returned fire, the bullet whizzing past Margaret's ear as she dropped to the ground. Emmett wasn't so lucky. He grunted in pain as Walter's shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Margaret fired again, forcing Walter to retreat. She crawled to Emmett's side, finding him conscious but bleeding heavily. "Go," he gasped. "Get help. I'll cover you." "I'm not leaving you," Margaret insisted, trying to stem the bleeding with her hand, but Emmett wouldn't be dissuaded. With remarkable strength for a man his age, he pushed her toward the river. "Go! Tell the marshal they're trying to circle around behind them." Reluctantly, Margaret obeyed, staying low as she made her way to the river. Behind her, Emmett's shotgun fired once more, then fell silent. The small boat was still where they had left it. Margaret pushed it into the water and climbed in, using the current and a single oar to guide it silently downstream, away from Walter and his men. Her plan was to circle back to the trading post, to warn Jackson about the flanking movement, but fate had other ideas. As she rounded a bend in the river, she found herself facing Jed Caldwell and two of his men, who were attempting to cross at a shallow point. Their eyes met across the water, recognition immediate. "Get her!" Jed shouted, splashing toward the boat. Margaret paddled frantically, trying to reach the opposite shore before they could intercept her, but the current was against her. One of Jed's men reached the boat and grabbed the side, nearly capsizing it. In desperation, Margaret struck him with the oar, knocking him back into the river. But Jed was closing in, his face a mask of rage. "Where's my brother?" he demanded, grabbing the boat's prow. Margaret raised her pistol, but Jed was faster. His hand closed around her wrist, twisting until the weapon fell into the bottom of the boat. With a powerful yank, he pulled her from the craft and into the cold water. Margaret fought like a wildcat, kicking and clawing as Jed dragged her toward the shore. She managed to break free briefly, but the second man caught her from behind, pinning her arms. "Take her back to camp," Jed ordered. "She'll tell us where Levi is, one way or another." The prospect of being taken prisoner by the Caldwells filled Margaret with cold terror. She knew what men like these were capable of, especially against a woman who had helped capture one of their own. But before they could drag her away, shots rang out from the riverbank. Jed's companion cried out and fell, releasing Margaret. Jed whirled, drawing his gun, but another shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. "Let her go, Caldwell!" Jackson's voice rang out from the darkness. Margaret had never been so glad to hear anyone in her life. She took advantage of Jed's distraction to break free, splashing toward the shore where Jackson stood, supported by two other men wearing marshal's badges. "The reinforcements arrived just after you left," Jackson explained as he helped her from the water. "We routed them at the trading post, then came looking for you when Emmett made it back." "Emmett's alive?" Margaret gasped. "Wounded but alive," Jackson confirmed, "and Walter Caldwell is in custody. That just leaves Jed." They turned to where Jed Caldwell was being pulled from the river by the other marshals, his face a mask of defiance despite his wound. "It's over, Jed," Jackson said as the outlaw was brought before them. "Your brothers are in custody, your gang scattered. There's no one left to fight for you." Jed spat on the ground. "This ain't over, Marshal, not by a long shot." "Yes, it is," Jackson replied firmly. "You're going to stand trial for murder just like Levi, and this time there will be plenty of witnesses." As Jed was led away, Jackson turned to Margaret, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though she was shivering from her immersion in the cold river. "Just wet and tired. Very tired." Jackson wrapped his coat around her shoulders, his arm lingering there. "You were incredibly brave, Margaret. Foolish, but brave." "I learned from the best," she replied with a small smile. The journey to Helena took 2 more days, with the Caldwell brothers securely guarded by a full complement of marshals. Margaret rode beside Jackson, their conversation flowing easily as miles passed beneath their horses' hooves. They spoke of their pasts, Margaret's childhood in Silverridge, Jackson's years as a Texas Ranger before becoming a U.S. Marshal. They shared stories of Edward and Clara, finding comfort in the memories rather than pain. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, something new began to grow between them. A connection forged in danger and strengthened by mutual respect and admiration. When they finally reached Helena, the Caldwell brothers were formally charged with multiple counts of murder, robbery, and assault. The evidence against them was overwhelming, with dozens of witnesses now willing to testify now that the threat of retaliation was removed. "The circuit judge arrives next week," Jackson told Margaret as they stood outside the territorial courthouse. "The trial should be quick. After that," he hesitated. "After that what?" Margaret prompted. Jackson looked uncomfortable. "I've been offered a position here in Helena. Permanent assignment to the territorial marshal's office." Margaret felt a mixture of emotions at his words, happiness for his recognition, but a sense of loss at the thought of returning to Silverridge alone. "That's wonderful," she said, trying to sound genuinely pleased. "You deserve it." "The thing is," Jackson continued, "I'm not sure if I'll take it." Margaret looked at him in surprise. "Why not? It sounds like a good opportunity." Jackson took a deep breath. "Because there's nothing for me in Helena. At least, nothing that matters." "What matters to you, Jackson?" Margaret asked softly. He met her gaze directly. "You, Margaret. These past days, as dangerous as they've been, have shown me that life is worth living again, that I can feel something I thought was gone forever." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. "Jackson, You don't have to say anything," he interrupted. "I know it's soon. You're still healing from Edward's loss, and I respect that. I just wanted you to know that whatever you decide to do, whether it's return to Silverridge or start fresh somewhere else, I'd like to be part of that decision. part of your future, if you'll have me." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. But they weren't tears of grief. For the first time in months, she felt truly alive, truly present in her own life. "I think," she said carefully, "that Edward would want me to be happy. In these past days, despite everything, I've been happier with you than I thought possible." Jackson's face lit up with hope. "Is that a yes?" Margaret laughed, a sound of genuine joy. "It's a, let's see where this leads. Is that enough for now?" "It's more than enough," Jackson assured her, taking her hand in his. 2 months later, Margaret stood on the porch of a small ranch house outside Silverridge. The autumn air was crisp and the mountains were ablaze with the gold and crimson of changing leaves. Behind her, Jackson was unloading supplies from their wagon, whistling as he worked. They had returned to Silverridge after the Caldwell brothers were convicted and sentenced to hang, finding the town changed by their absence. Without the shadow of fear the Caldwells had cast, people walked taller, spoke more freely. Margaret had changed too. The wedding dress that had been her armor was now carefully packed away in a cedar chest, a reminder of Edward and the love they had shared, but no longer a prison of grief. She had said her goodbyes, visiting his grave one last time before moving forward with her life. Jackson had declined the position in Helena, instead accepting an assignment as the new federal marshal for the Silverridge region. Together, they had purchased this small ranch, ironically, the very claim that Edward had registered and the Caldwells had tried to steal. Margaret's parents had been cautiously supportive of her new relationship, though her mother still occasionally gave her questioning looks, as if wondering if she had recovered too quickly. But those who had seen Margaret and Jackson together understood. Theirs was not a love that erased the past, but one that honored it while building something new. "Penny for your thoughts," Jackson said, coming up behind her and slipping his arms around her waist. Margaret leaned back against him, savoring his warmth. "I was just thinking about how much has changed, how much I've changed." "For the better, I hope," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. She turned in his arms to face him. "Definitely for the better. I was sleepwalking before, wearing that wedding dress, living in the past." Jackson brushed a strand of hair from her face. "And now I'm wide awake," she said, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "And I wouldn't have it any other way." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across their new home, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a grief so consuming she had worn her wedding dress to sleep each night, to a love she had never expected to find again. She thought about Edward, hoping he would be happy for her. And about Clara, Jackson's lost wife, whose memory he now carried with love rather than pain. Life on the frontier was unpredictable, often dangerous, and rarely easy. But standing in the arms of her U.S. Marshal, watching the stars emerge above their small piece of the Wild West, Margaret Owens knew one thing for certain: she was finally, truly awake. "You know," Jackson said as they walked hand in hand back to the house, "I remember the first time I saw you, sweeping that porch in your wedding dress. I thought you were the saddest, most beautiful woman I'd ever seen." Margaret smiled at the memory. "And what do you think now?" Jackson stopped, turning to face her fully, his eyes reflecting the last light of day. "I think you're still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. But now you're also the strongest, bravest, and most alive." As they reached the porch of their new home, Jackson paused, a mischievous glint in his eye. "You know, there's still that wedding dress in your trunk." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" "Well," he said, suddenly looking uncharacteristically shy, "I was thinking maybe someday soon it might see a proper wedding after all." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "Jackson Irwin, is that a proposal?" "Not yet," he clarified quickly. "Just a possibility. When you're ready." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the scar on his cheek that he'd earned, protecting her from the Caldwells. "I think I might be ready sooner than either of us expected." Jackson's smile was brighter than the first stars appearing overhead. In that case, Miss Owens, consider me officially courting you. I believe you've been doing that since the day you arrived in Silverridge, Marshal, she teased. As they entered their home together, closing the door on the gathering night, Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. The wedding dress might find its purpose again someday, but for now it remained a reminder of what she had lost and what she had found. She had worn her wedding dress to sleep until a cowboy had said it was time to wake up. And now, fully awake, Margaret Owens was ready to embrace whatever the future might bring.